Good morning. Welcome to the training day. Before we start the activities for today, I will present to you a small introduction of the activities for today. This is the training day of DMDU 2020, and the idea is that I will explain in the following minutes the plan for today that was prepared by Dr. Stephen Popper. How we will spend the day today? Well, first we will discuss a bit of history and in a seminar presented by Dr. Stephen Popper. We will also present some ideas behind the society and the reason for the training day. And then I will discuss with you what is the plan for the training day today. We are the Society for Decision Making Under Deep Uncertainty. We are present virtually at the 8th Annual International Workshop of DMDU Society, a professional society for the members of many professions who work in the field of DMDU. This is a multi- and interdisciplinary association, welcoming and of service equally to practitioners, policymakers, researchers, and academics. DMDU Society membership has asked for short training courses that can help the audience understand a little bit better the methods and the applications of DMDU research. But training is also supposed to be intended to be useful for DMDU users of research done using methods developed by the society. Therefore, the idea of this training day is to be able to be useful for a wide range of public. We have worked to make today relevant for all of you. First, we will provide an overview of underlying key concepts and methods. We will discuss a framework for assessing DMDU concepts and methods. And finally, we will present demos of major methods and applications. Also, we have prepared, although in a remote format, a way of interacting with you, so the speakers and the presenters in the demos can read and answer to your questions if you have them. So we will have 4 demos after the introductory session. Please check the schedule in the following link. This is our official website for the annual meeting, and you can check the training day agenda for today there. So we will spend first a discussion. We will have first a discussion on a generalized framework for DMDU methods. This will take us about an hour, and then we will go into more details with demos that will take between 45 and 60 minutes. Each demo, between 30 and 45 minutes long, will be followed by a 15-minute live questions and answers session with presenters. All demos will be recorded, as well as the introductory seminar, and later made available for streaming on DMDU Society web pages, specifically on the website of the annual meeting 2020. We will have first a seminar, a guide to the field. This seminar will be presented by Dr. Stephen Popper, a senior economist at the RAND Corporation and professor at the Pardee RAND Graduate School. Popper has vast experience using DMDU methods, and he has used his analysis to support the White House Office of Science and Technology and many other executive agencies of the executive branch. He co-authored the flagship study of the RAND Pardee Center for Long-Term Range Global Policy and the Future of Human Condition, Shaping the Next 100 Years, New Methods for Quantitative Long-Term Policy Analysis. Then we will go into the first demo, which is the demo for infogap decision theory. This demo will be provided by Professor Jacob Ben, who initiated and developed infogap decision theory for modeling and managing deep uncertainty. Professor Jacob has published more than 100 articles and 6 books. He's a professor of mechanical engineering and holds the chair of technology and economics at the Technical University in Israel. Before we dive into more details, I will discuss briefly what each of these applications entails. Infogap tries to address the disparity between what you do know and what you need to know to make a good decision. Manage uncertainty in parameters, vectors, and especially functions. Probability distributions are uncertain or lacking in this framework. You don't need infogap if you know what are the probability density functions of a decision problem. Well, what are you expected to learn in this demo? First, prioritize decision alternatives in terms of robustness to uncertainty, maximal tolerable uncertainty to achieve critical goals. Opportunities from uncertainty, minimum required uncertainty to achieve wonderful outcomes. Explore trade-offs between robustness, opportunities, and outcomes. And potential applications of this framework include applications in engineering, economics, conservation, national security, medicine, and many others. If you want more information, you can write directly to Jacob, and he will go into more detail in a bit in his demo. The second demo is focused on Rhodium, which is Python library for doing robust decision multi-objective optimization. This demo will be presented by David Gold, who is a PhD candidate in the READ group at Cornell University. David's work focuses on decision-making for multi-actor and for multi-actor water supply systems under conditions of deep uncertainty. This demo will also be presented by Antonia, she is a postdoctoral associate of the READ research group at Cornell University. Her work focuses on decision-making for complex multi-actor water resource systems as well. Rhodium is a Python library that facilitates many objective robust decision-making. Rhodium is applicable to decision-making problems that are subject to deep uncertainties. Capabilities of this library include multi-objective optimization, exploratory modeling, scenario discovery, global sensitivity analysis, and Rhodium provides these tools in a simple declarative style that can seamlessly interact with models built in many common programming languages, including Fortran, Excel, R, Python, C++, and many others. The developer of Rhodium is David Hadcap. Common uses of Rhodium include MOEA, research for optimal policies to multi-objective decision problems, for visualizing trade-offs between optimal policies, perform regional and global sensitivity analysis, reevaluate policies under deep uncertainty, and perform scenario discovery with PRIM and CART. The third demo will focus on robust decision-making and Tableau applications, and will be presented by Dr. David Groves, who is a senior policy researcher at the RAND Corporation, co-director of the RAND Center of Decision-Making Under Uncertainty, co-director of the RAND Climate Resilience Center, and professor at the Purdue RAND Graduate School. Dr. Groves is a key developer of new methods for decision-making under deep uncertainty and works directly with organizations worldwide. Decisions tools, this demo will focus on decision support tools that help design strategies for the uncertain future. You will learn how to use these tools in several types of DMDU analysis, including developing Puerto Rico's economic and disaster recovery plan, devising robust water resources strategies in Mexico, comparing risks to California-based Delta D system. In our final demo, we will discuss exploratory modeling and analysis, the EMA workbench. And this demo will be lectured by Branca Jaffino. He is a PhD researcher at the Policy Analysis section of the Faculty of Technology, Policy and Management. His research is aimed at developing social inclusive adaptation pathways for an urbanized delta in the An Giang province in Vietnam. What is EMA? EMA Workbench is a Python library implementing most computational techniques used for DMDU analysis and research. What it will do for you, it will help you understand DMDU techniques for your specific case, allowing you to focus also in specific applications in which EMA Workbench has been used. What are typical applications? Well, these include applications with strong focus on case studies involving agent-based models, hydrodynamic models, and system dynamics models. If you are interested in more, please visit this website where you will find the recently published book, Decision Making Under Deep Uncertainty from Theory and Practice, in which each one of these frameworks is discussed in more detail. And without further delay, I will now give the word to Stephen Popper.
Hello and welcome. My name is Stephen Popper. I am a senior economist at the RAND Corporation, and I'm also the current chair for education and training of the International Society for Decision Making Under Deep Uncertainty. We make it a practice at each of our annual meetings to set aside a separate day devoted to new attendees or members of the general public who may join us to really provide a framing, set a context for what will be going on in the following days. So this part of our training day is designed to provide an overview, a framing, a context for understanding DMDU concepts and DMDU methods. So the question very naturally arises, what exactly is deep uncertainty? Well, we tend to speak of deep uncertainty when we either cannot know or cannot agree on what the probable future values are of important system variables. That is to say, we can't assign probabilities to different assumptions of inputs. Similarly, if we do not know or we cannot agree on what the model is, what the true system of underlying causality that relates actions to consequences, are we dealing with decreasing returns to scale, constant returns to scale, increasing returns to scale? And the third category is less technical, but this really comes when we do not know or cannot agree exactly how should we evaluate different outcomes. When we see the result of a simulation, is it good or bad according to the many variables that we care about? You might call this, instead of deep uncertainty, deep controversy. When do the DMDU methods become important? Well, the answer is that it very much depends. But if you're dealing in a problem space where you really can't be certain that uncertainty is well characterized, well captured by probabilities, if you are looking at decisions, it's not this or that, but there are a number of different options that you have available to you, and the complexity of the problem that you're dealing with. Complexity both in the colloquial sense of just a lot of moving parts, but also in a more technical sense of when you have emergence and path dependence and unpredictable outcomes from initial conditions. That's really the sphere where it really becomes valuable to think about DMDU methodology. Now, this is an attempt on my part to generalize, give you a broad overview over DMDU methods, and that's because the usual audience for this presentation comes from different levels of exposure and awareness of DMDU, and so there's a desire to provide a common frame of reference, particularly those who are going to be participating in the sessions of the annual meeting. But this is also intended to provide a practical guide to allow better understanding of the demos that will be part of the training day, the presentations at the meeting proper, and follow the discussions about different technique and methods that will appear. For those who are not going to be attending the sessions, there's still value in kind of addressing the question, where do DMDU methods really enter into analysis? When should they be thought of, and how do you actually conduct such an analysis? Now, it's by no means an easy task to try and generalize everything in a consistent framework, in part because this is a relatively new field, and not only that, but it's proliferating in a number of truly exciting directions. So there's no way that this generalization is going to capture all aspects of the field. Different approaches and applications might have emphases on different steps and different orders of the steps. And, there are fundamental, genuine differences in approach. But what I'm going to suggest is that I will provide you with some of the hallmarks of a DMDU analysis and DMDU methods, which I would argue are fairly generally applicable across the field. And I'm going to do so by suggesting a general framework consisting of a series of steps. And the first step is the one where you actually formulate the questions based on some issue. Now, that sounds very trivial, but as I will argue, in many ways, this is perhaps the most important step, and one that sets this analysis off on a different course from more traditional approaches to analysis. Secondly, specify the objectives in terms of goals. Again, this sounds a bit anodyne, but the idea of beginning the analysis from the end, really being certain about how you are trying to address questions and what these answers are intended to provide, is crucial. Third step, gather information and specify the system structure, the model, if you will. This now starts to sound a more familiar starting point. Discover alternative courses of action. Part of the analysis is to determine, even if you began with just one or two conceptions of what one could do if you are advising policies, exploring what the true range is of alternatives is very much at the heart of DMDU analyses, as is the idea of generating futures based on uncertainties. That is to say, to look at models, to look at different assumptions, and see what the multiplicity of different futures might be as a result of that. Notice using the word futures rather than scenarios. Very often in this field, scenarios has a particular meaning very much similar to the one used by the Global Business Network, which is to say a certain regime, a certain set of conditions in which a number of specific futures might fit, but are related by certain underlying factors. How do you deal with the multiplicity of futures? Well, the next step is to design an experimental framework to try and look across these futures and interrogate them for the information they provide. And what information are you looking for? Well, you are really trying to test these alternative actions against this course of potential futures and really trying to understand what are the properties of different actions that one might take. What are these alternatives? What are the implications of choosing one or the other? And in particular, what are those few factors that one should really concentrate on in order to make certain that your short-term actions are consistent with your long-term goals? And that really provides the bottom line of an RDM analysis, a DMDU analysis, which have always had an emphasis on the ability to communicate to different groups. Large dependence on visualization, visual tools in general, in order to be able to communicate most effectively to those who need to understand, both the decision makers and those who have a stake in the consequences of the decisions that are being made. Now, I have suggested these framings. They should not be understood as being necessarily sequential. There are different entry points for different methods. And further, the inherent principle in a DMDU analysis is that of iteration. That is to say, you are going to go through the analysis several times, gaining more insight into action alternatives, more insight into exactly what needs to be modeled and what needs to be simulated, and new insight into what are the questions that need to be asked and addressed. So let's begin at the beginning. Now, I have suggested that this is in many ways the key step that really frames everything that follows. And let's take a higher order view of that. Let's talk about a more traditional analysis, which, even though it may not say it, really kind of somehow forces us to be in the business of prediction. What I say, of course, is going to be a great generalization and a caricature, but I think it is largely captures the main thread of many traditional analyses. And you're really beginning with some variation of what the future will be. You know, collect data, build a model, really get a sense of being able to get a handle on what the future may be. Of course, if it's a sufficiently complex and uncertain future, this very act is a very controversial one, and one that can be prejudicial to the analysis, because people are not stupid. They understand that the assumptions that you make up front are going to determine in part the outcomes of the analysis. So you really run the risk of having it devolve into controversy at the very beginning. And then the question is, well, what would be the optimal decision for us to take for near-term actions? And the word optimal, then becomes very problematic, because what may be optimal for one particular future may be very bad in another. And unfortunately, we don't have a theory of the second best. We don't know that if the actual future is just a little bit off from that which we had predicted, that our course of action will itself only be a little bit off from what we had hoped. It could be that it could fail disastrously just because of those small changes. And then, of course, being good analysts, we will do sensitivity analyses, assuming that the time and money still remains in the analysis. But usually this is testing sensitivities around the space, the point estimate of the optimal decision, and not really looking more broadly. Now, we will contrast this with a different approach for DMDU methods, where the question we are more asking is not what will happen and what we should do, but what are the limitations of any particular plan and how can we improve them? There are a number of places where you can start with this, but the best is really to turn the telescope around and look through the other end and start looking from the end rather than the beginning of the analysis. What do we want to answer? What short-term actions would be consistent with our long-term goals? And now, in this type of analysis, we're characterizing uncertainty, but not in terms of probabilities, which in a sufficiently deep state of uncertainty are not really knowable, but rather characterizing uncertainty by what they tell us about the choices that we face. And here again, what we are trying to do, the analytical enterprise, is to see if we can modify a plan to be more robust across a wider range of potential futures. And there is an inherent link in this type of research between the analytical process and policy, because we are asking questions formally. What are the trade-offs between robustness, feasibility, so on and so forth? We're creating analytical product that does not need to be interpreted by policymakers, but fits directly into the policy process. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. And again, the concept of iteration is very strong. Now, the types of questions that we ask about the future and our policies and strategies are not unfamiliar. How can we discover and choose among alternative courses of action? How do we weigh the alternatives that we have developed in light of the unpredictability that exists? How can we apply intelligent stress testing to any given plan or investment or course of action or a strategy? And how can we best prepare for the future? Certainly a question that has a lot of pertinence in our times. But the presence of deep uncertainty uncertainty really confounds the ability to address and find meaningful answers to these questions with traditional analyses. Let's look at some specific examples. Here are 3 vignettes that I will offer based on actual studies to kind of illustrate some of the narratives that are present around applying traditional analysis to deeply uncertain conditions. The first of our vignette is called Your Assumptions Are Wrong, and this takes place in the capital of of California about 3 decades ago. And the scene is analysts who are briefing the chancellors of the state higher education systems and state officials, and they're trying to address the problem of will there potentially be deficits in the ability of these institutions to accommodate future cohorts of students. And so this begins by the chancellor of the system saying, look, there is no problem, but the analysts say, well, the analysis suggests that there could be future pressure on the state budget, and that might lead to a problem. No, we looked at your work. We argue with your assumptions. Your elasticities are wrong. Your enrollment forecasts are outdated. Well, yes, but even using different assumptions, the analysis would show that there are vulnerabilities to budget shortfalls. Then the chancellor pulls out his or her trump card. Well, the governor gave me his word that we will have all the funds that we need. Let's go to the second vignette. Now we're not looking at assumptions, we're looking at models. And here we are in the Pentagon after the first Gulf War, although at this point there have been so many, it's difficult to keep track. And analysts are briefing a very senior Air Force general on which new weapon systems they should purchase. And the analyst says, well, the bottom line is that our simulations suggest you should buy more of weapon A than weapon B and the least of weapon C. Now, there's somebody who is opposed to that weapon system, so he asks the question, well, what reliability did you assume for the weapon system? 85%. Okay, well, what happens if you either raise or lower that reliability? Well, if you raise the reliability, you would buy more of weapon B than weapon A, and if you lower the reliability, you would buy more of weapon C than weapon A. At which point the general says, wait a minute, I thought analysis was supposed to help. You're telling me that if you got either up or down in reliability, you will buy less of this weapon that you tell me is the best one for us to buy? What kind of model is this? Here's a third narrative entitled Surprise. And here the scene is historical. Now we are at the French general headquarters at the beginning of the Second World War, and the analysts are briefing the general staff on recent intelligence, and the problem they're trying to solve is how to deploy the French and Allied armies to counter the German invasion threat. The intelligence officer says, you know, we've picked up unexpected sounds of German units in a place where we really didn't expect they would be. And the head general says, look, we captured their secret plans last November. I know these people. They plan to come in the same way they did in the beginning of the First World War. And a staff officer says, well, you know, we could put some of our mobile divisions really at the vulnerable point where our 2 main army groups meet. We just have weak troops there now. And the general says, no. War is made with artillery. I know that you can't get artillery through the forest of the Ardennes. They will come from the north. I need to have those units where the fight will be. 3 vignettes, but probably not unfamiliar if you have spent time in policy or government trying to conduct analyses to support. So how should we frame our questions? If this first step is all about framing questions, what questions should we ask when we are facing deep uncertainty? What questions do we ask if we are really unsure about assumptions? Well, they're questions like, how can we be systematic in reasoning over a range of potentially differing assumptions? Besides the explicit assumptions, what are the implicit assumptions that we should be worried about? And how fragile is our intended course of action if we were to change some of these assumptions? This now begins to be the sort of question that decision makers are really asking, as opposed to the predictions which they usually ask for. What about models? Well, questions like, what does our model tell us about fundamental relationships among the elements of our system? If we explore different specifications of parameter values or model structure, how much difference does it make? And can we use this model with different assumptions to generate a whole set, an ensemble of related cases that we can then reason over to better understand our response options in the face of our uncertainty? How do we deal with surprise? What questions should we ask ourselves? Well, what are the key assumptions upon which a strategy depends? Which assumptions, if violated, would now call the proposed strategy into serious question? How could we modify the strategy to make it more robust to futures with broken assumptions? Let's look at the next in our set of steps, framing the general concepts and methods of decision-making under deep uncertainty, specifying the objectives in terms of goals. Now, this is not a trivial task in any sufficiently complex problem. We're usually interested in more than one measure of good outcome, and very often these measures work in opposite directions. We're interested in the state of the economy and economic growth. We're also interested in the state of the environment. So as we look across our many cases and assumptions and alternative futures and courses of action, how do we really assess what constitutes a good or bad outcome? Now, the key here is understanding we're really no longer in the game of trying to predict outcomes. What we're really trying to do is choose among alternative actions. So, it may be that different assumptions lead to widely different outcomes in terms of system parameters. But if in each of those cases, it doesn't change our rank order of preference among the alternatives that we have available to us, they really are irrelevant for the purpose we have in mind. So we usually use some form of the concept of regret to really measure objectives. How much would we regret having chosen course of action A in a world in which B would have been the more optimal strategy? Bear in mind, we don't know beforehand which world we're going to see. So if we look at the amount of regret, this really then allows us to better understand what the information and the analysis is telling us about our choices. And when you're in the world of many different objectives that you are trying to balance among and trade-offs that you are making, you're no longer in the world of optimization. You're now in the world of satisficing, to use the term coined by Nobel laureate Herbert Simon. How well can we do? What kind of a hedged position can we shoot for with a particular course of action? This really brings out a very strong point about DMDU and DMDU analyses. There are really two cultures that we're dealing with. One is the culture and the output that analysts produce. And then there is the question of what policymakers actually need, what they're looking for, even if they are not asking for it. In the analytical culture, which many of us come from, it is numerate, it is reductive, it is systematic, and the fundamental logic that is used is deductive logic. In the culture of policy, this is really not the case. It's a narrative-based culture. It's one that pays great attention to the details, and it's very nuanced in terms of the rules and ordering of information. In short, it's a culture that's rooted in inductive logic. What would happen if this occurred? If we do this, what would they do? What are the things that we should be worried about? A DMDU analysis will tend to lower the mismatch between what the analysis itself provides and what the policymakers actually seek. And this means that an analysis based on DMDU principles is well suited to support collaboration and joint drawing of inferences about decision choices and, importantly, risk-bearing. The next step is to gather information and to specify the system structure. Information and structure are certainly related, but we tend to think about models and data in many ways that is restrictive. One way that DMDU helps is it allows us to enfranchise types of information that's not easily codified as quantitative data. And this partly stems from, again, the ability to provide views that people can share and that they can look at together. They can look at the output, the graphic changes, and exchange different areas of expertise and knowledge as they are looking at it together. The word model itself is problematic because it suggests providing an accurate synthesis of reality that really forces us very often to spend a great deal of time and effort in the beginning and usually all through the analysis of trying to put together the most accurate model and representation. But what we really need is to have an understanding of the structure of the system in which our problem is placed that's sufficient to address our questions. Remember the questions that I raised previously. So this means that a model can be, fit for the particular purpose required for the DMDU analysis. It means that we can start with very simple, crude models, make advantage of the iteration, look at output, get to a more nuanced understanding of where we need more detail. And in a very real sense of the word, a model will appear as not only an input but an output of the DMDU process itself. It evolves as part of the analysis. So here's a graphic that tries to bring that into play. Around here we see 5 different potential uses for a model. The one on the left, upper left, prediction is what we usually think of. And when we think of model validity, we think of, well, how well does it predict? And as you see here, on a range from 0 to 5, this particular model only scores a 2. It's not very good at prediction. It's a little better at post-diction. It's a 4, looking at historical data. But it really is an excellent model for the explorations that we are interested in, the generation of cases to get coarse initial predictions that we can then enhance once we have a better understanding of what are those areas that really make a difference, again, to the fundamental question, not what will happen, but how do we understand the choices in front of us and how do we choose among them? The next step is to discover alternative courses of action. Well, what does this mean? When we ask about the future, it usually is not out of idle curiosity. We are really trying to do something. There is a normative component. We want to enhance our prospects for meeting goals. So we're interested in understanding better the nature of our options, discovering additional options that we might not have thought of, modifying or hybridizing among options to evolve them and to develop them in order to better achieve a well-hedged position, and ultimately being able to decide among several options after analyzing criteria for choosing. I'll illustrate this by drawing on some work that colleagues of mine did, looking at the problem of inundation and sea level rise in Saigon. There is an infrastructure in place, and the question is, what kind of soft options might improve this strategy, such as raising homes, relocation, better management of groundwater, capture of rainwater, and so on. So here's a graphic that shows the current state of the infrastructure and the type of protection it provides. It can deal up to about a 45 centimeter increase in river level and up to about a 6% increase in rainfall intensity. How would different options add to the robustness of this strategy? For example, if we were to also introduce elevations of homes, we see a considerable increase both in the robustness to river level increase and increase in rainfall intensity. And there are other options as well. The relocation option, the elevate option, the rainwater option, the groundwater option. These are considered as a set of one-offs. Obviously, a more sophisticated analysis would look at the interplay among them. But what we get from this is adding these measures improves the robustness properties of the plan. And moreover, a map like this now begins to help stakeholders and governments to have structured discussions. For example, there may be different ministries that for their own reasons may be advocates of one particular plan or another. How do you make the trade-offs? Well, one way is to begin to add in issues of cost. How much would these various measures cost if you added them in on top of the existing infrastructure? So now you have an opportunity to present something to stakeholders that they can debate, and then the question becomes how much robustness they can afford, which I will submit is more useful than debating, what the future is going to be. And there are other ways of presenting this type of information. Marjolaine Hasnot at Deltares and her colleagues have developed a very useful, dynamic, adaptive policy pathway mapping that gives you information not only about different alternative actions, but where there might be trade-off points, where you might be able to detect tipping points, where you should be trying to detect signals to tell you whether you are heading into one type of future or another. Let's go to the next of our steps. Generate futures based on uncertainties. Now we're really talking about the fun stuff. And once you relieve yourself of the need to be predictive, that actually enhances the value of examining many futures. Models are fascinating and marvelous human artifacts, and they're often, I think, wrongly judged to be inadequate because we ask them to be predictive. And of course, in a sufficiently uncertain environment, rugged conditions, they're going to fail at that task more often than not. But in fact, the model is just fine, and it really is a marvelous tool. It's just being used the wrong way. It's being asked to provide answers beyond its power. But if we are no longer using the model as a prediction tool, but instead as an engine for generating consistent logical futures, this may in fact reveal its true value to us. Go back to the example of the Saigon river and water control. Basically, the idea is looking across different futures, and this graphic will become a little clearer in another slide. With a given policy in a risk model will give us a simulation suggesting what the risk is for this policy and this future. So each of the parameters describing the futures can vary over a wide range. Here you see a set of 6 of them, and some futures might have little change in climate and relatively small population, whereas others might have, considerably more variable climate, larger, poorer, more vulnerable population. So when you start looking at these different futures, you can begin to assess outcomes across a very wide space. Predict then act approach, the traditional approach to analysis, you are encouraged to find an expected or most probable future. In the DMDU approach, we're looking at an ensemble of plausible futures. So now what do we do with this? Well, the next step is we design an experimental framework. How do we look across these futures to get the answers that we wish to find? I have suggested before that a key distinction of DMDU methodologies is their capacity for exploration and iteration. In this case, iteration doesn't just mean the combinatorics of multiplying numbers of different sets of conditions times the number of actions to get a huge database of potential outcomes. Iteration in this case also means multiple trials and adjustments, drawing of inferences, enhancing the knowledge base and system understanding as we proceed through the analysis. So here the essence of design is to do so in a way that will allow us to explore all the futures and uncertainties, but reaping the advantage of having iterative compound experiments that will allow us to refine the analysis as we go along. Let's make this a little concrete. Here is one approach that we use very often to set out problems of this sort. It's this 2x2 matrix that really group together under 4 headings all of the aspects of the problem that we would wish to explore over as part of the analysis. This actually is taken from an analysis of national strategy for the use of natural gas. So, as I say, we begin from the end. What are the things that we're interested in? What do we want to measure so we can understand good or bad outcomes? And here you see a list: total system cost, total fuel cost, greenhouse gas emissions, land use requirements, and so forth. This too is something that we're going to explore over because we need to do the trade-off analysis. Another, obviously, is the exogenous uncertainties we face. What would be the cost of capital, future demand for electricity, price path for natural gas? What might be the cost or pricing of CO2 emissions? The next category are the things that we consider to be the levers under our control. And here we're speaking of levers because the idea is we want to talk at the atomic level. The idea is different levers can be included, excluded, combined in different ways to form different strategies, but this is sort of the lowest level of what are the actions that the authorities have. And notice a subtlety here, because what is a lever under control for one analysis might be an exogenous uncertainty for another. So, for example, in most cases, cost of capital is an exogenous uncertainty. If what you are doing is modeling the behavior and choices for a central bank, however, then the cost of capital is one of the levers under their control. And the subtle point is that when you conduct an analysis in this way, you have drawn the decision maker into the analysis. You are not modeling the system, you are modeling decisions within the system. And then the fourth category, as I had suggested earlier, we have not only parametric uncertainties, but potential structural uncertainties. These are the relationships that tie together cause and effect. What levers under what plausible futures defined by a set of assumptions about uncertainties are going to lead to outcomes that we observe. The next step is to test the actions against the futures. Here again, I'm going to draw from some prior work on natural gas. The experimental design is built for iteration and testing. We begin with the computer and some model that we place within the computer. We have a range of variable and structural uncertainties, the X factors and the R factors in the previous, and we're going to feed these into the computer and then see a bunch of different futures. And then humans are going to observe this, and then they're going to make changes for the next iteration. Now, this too is an interesting point about computers and DMDU methodology. We are facing a number of decisions about how analysts are going to use enhanced powers of computation. One path is the path of trying to increase the accuracy of our predictions. But I would submit that at least for the near term, many of the systems we're most interested in are fundamentally complex and are not going to lend themselves easily to prediction. And we may be running a Red Queen's race in the sense of if we only built out yet another module or a submodule to a submodule, we would be able to predict more accurately. I suspect that's not the case. A second is to go over completely to artificial intelligence systems and machine learning. Have expert systems make the decisions. But we have problems. We don't feel really comfortable with that. We have problems of algorithmic bias, difficulty in really understanding what are the algorithms that the machine learning system has come up with, and getting insight into whether, in fact, they might not have some hidden faults that would lead to incorrect outcomes. So I would suggest that the type of analysis I'm speaking of here and that my colleagues pursue is really a third type, a third paradigm for using enhanced computation, and that is inherently human in the loop systems. These are not intended to be Deus ex machina. They're not intended to be the magic answer machines. We specifically have human beings in the loop to draw inferences, to come up with new questions, to change the analysis on subsequent iterations. So, what we would do is we would have a set of candidate strategies that we would then run across a set of futures to generate an ensemble of cases, simulations of a single strategy against multiple futures, testing each strategy in turn. And humans will look at this and also, suggest different strategies. We went through such a process. In the end, my colleagues and I came up with 1,400 alternative futures as our test base, 7 strategies that had survived the previous steps, which generated nearly 10,000 cases, which we were then able to ask questions like, to what extent do these cases meet the criteria, for example, cost or emissions or land use? And how do we then winnow among these candidate strategies to a more refined set of robust strategies? Well, here again, computers come into play. And in particular, this is really very interesting. We use the computer to identify decision-relevant scenarios analytically, rather than trying to define them ex ante, as one would do in the more standard inductive logic approach to the construction of scenarios. So in the previous view, we generated a database of nearly 10,000 outcomes. And now we start asking questions. This figure represents the database. Each circle is one case. And we look at cases of interest, which are in the dark. Let us say, for a given strategy, what are those cases where the strategy failed to meet minimal criteria in terms of our outcome measures? And what various computer algorithms will do is they will propose different boxes balancing coverage versus density as a description of what is systematic among these cases. What is it that ties them together and leads them to failure? So you will see on the horizontal axis, this is defined by a certain range for one of our uncertain variables and a different range on the vertical axis for a different variable. This is a concise way of describing roughly what are those conditions that would likely cause this strategy to fail. And in doing so, what we have defined is a scenario. We have described conditions that are consistent, that lead to a particular set of outcomes. So the scenario comes analytically out of the process, rather than us having to decide, what are the main drivers, what are the variables that we think are most important. Now we can see which are the ones that really make the distinction. So this is very useful because it answers the question, what is an important scenario for us to consider? And I would submit that an important scenario, again, tells us something important about our decisions. It tells us information about the choices that we have for action. It illustrates the criteria upon which to base decisions about choice, and it characterizes uncertainty in terms of the choices that we're actually trying to decide among. And so we use this to then modify these candidate strategies, and in the end came up 3 modified robust strategies that we were able to assess in our report. How did we assess them? Well, we examined the trade-offs and we weighed the policy choices that were associated with them. So these policy relevant scenarios help to identify robust strategies and the trade-offs involved. Again, emphasis is on visual output, so you can get wider participation, so you can convey the results more easily. This will support discussion across viewpoints, and it also allows a capacity to drill down if people want to understand, well, what are the actual cases behind this that leads to this? You can actually point to it. This is an interesting graphic because it shows outcomes for 4 different strategies after having identified a key uncertainty. And you see that some of them, if we look at the vertical axis, we're now measuring the level of regret, where the higher we go, it's more regret. Some of them have more regret at one end of the spectrum. Some of them have more regret on the other end of the spectrum. But interestingly, there's that green case that whereas it is not optimal really for any of the settings of this uncertain variable, has the nice property of failing gracefully across the whole region. If you were very much uncertain, if you were risk averse, this would be a candidate suggesting itself as a robust strategy. The final step is to communicate and monitor results. Absolutely crucial for a methodology that is so tightly bound to addressing questions of policy. And this is truly important because a DMDU analysis properly done is something that facilitates important conversations among stakeholders and policymakers. In 2009, the National Research Council in the United States determined that for sufficiently wicked problems, say trying to understand climate change, the interplay between analysis and policy should be a process of deliberation with analysis. That is to say, again, iteration, a cycling between discussions among stakeholders, planners, and policymakers, with then reference to the analysts who would then produce output that would feed into the next iteration of the process. So here you see an idealization of such a process of analysis integrated with a process of deliberation. You begin with structuring the decision, as we have already discussed, then turning to the analytical generation of different cases based upon that discussion, the scenario discovery methodology that I just talked about earlier that then lead to the identification of scenarios that illuminate vulnerabilities and the influence of uncertainties, provide a trade-off analysis, and then refer back to the deliberators who can absorb this, draw inferences, form new questions, and the cycle begins again, generating new options and eventually robust strategies. And a robust strategy is pretty much what it sounds like. Usually requires an application of adaptation with monitoring. So a static strategy might be, we need to do something, let's do it now and hope for the best when 2035 arrives. But if we can be flexible and adaptive, we can watch the future unfold and improve if needed. A somewhat more sophisticated approach, which we routinely do in these analyses, is to decide what are those things that could and should be done now, irrespective of what the future might hold, and which are those that can be left until some later time, noting the signposts that we would wish to monitor to determine when and if these additional measures should be taken. So this picture illustrates the dilemma we find ourselves in. It describes the eve of the election, 2016, for the U.S. president. In blue is sort of the end forecast of what the chances were for Hillary Clinton to win the presidency, and in the red we have the forecast for Donald Trump. If this is the only information that we can generate, then we are in trouble, because this really doesn't capture the uncertainties, and most importantly, it doesn't allow people to think actively and in a sophisticated manner about potential outcomes. Then results came, and the next day there were recriminations about the pollsters getting things wrong. Well, they didn't get things wrong. 28.6% chance of an outcome is actually relatively high. If you're a baseball player, it makes you one of the most effective hitters on the team or even in the league. So if this is how we're going to communicate, it is going to leave us with inadequate means for really dealing in a sophisticated manner with the uncertainties we face. And I think it is vital that we do come up with better ways, because we've entered a world with many challenges for democratic governance and for the institutions of democratic governance. We have an increasing number of players. It's never been easier to gather information, to communicate messages, to coalesce constituencies for promoting the interests of different stakeholder groups. And at the same time, the complexity and the nature of the problems we face are similarly diffused. Responsibility has become less clear. Who has the what office, what agency is responsible for dealing with the intertwined issues that confront us? So we require, in short, an ability to function in an environment of many interests, many stakeholders, a wide range of views of how the future might unfold, and deep uncertainty. The current state of best practice is insufficient to meet our needs, and DMDU applications do hold promise for providing the means for doing so. Now, the Society has been always interested in outreach, and recently, just in the last year, a Society-sponsored handbook of DMDU methods has appeared. It's intended for a wide range of audiences, not just those who might be methodologists or practitioners, but also those who may be the audiences or the receivers of output from DMDU studies. It is a very detailed and structured view, and the best news, as far as you're concerned, is that 4 organizations have underwritten the costs to make it fully available for free. So you can go to the URL at the top of this page, and to the extent to which what I have said has been of interest, you can continue your journey into the world of decision-making under deep uncertainty. In many ways, the work that I and my colleagues have done has been to utilize new tools that are available to us to actually carry out some of the ideas of our predecessors in the history of thought, in the history of science. Everybody from William of Ockham and Occam's razor through Herbert Simon and his concepts of uncertainty absorption and satisficing, and including Francis Bacon, very often held to be one of the founders of the philosophy of experimental science. And I'll close with a quotation from him, which was, "If we begin with certainties, we shall end in doubts. But if we begin with doubts and are patient in them, we shall end in certainties." And that is the promise that keeps I and my colleagues developing this field of decision-making under deep uncertainty. Thank you very much for your attention.